I'm going to start with a couple of sentences from Naomi's last book, Doppelganger, which actually quite perfectly sum up the motivation behind global dialogues, and also sets us up nicely for the conversation to follow. She writes, "It's tough to live in a moment when so many truths that had been sold as settled suddenly become wobbly and wavy under our feet. It's especially tough at a time when a great deal else feels uncertain. The possibility of owning a house, scraping together enough money for soaring rents, or holding on to any given job, or even knowing how much the basics of life are going to cost week to week. It's all tilting and rolling, and so much, like the assumed predictability of seasons, will never be stable again, at least not for several generations. And that is in a best case scenario. All of this destabilization places demands on us to change, to reassess, and to reimagine who we need to become." There's a piece that Naomi wrote after visiting the Vatican, soon after Laudato Si was issued. And again, this is a quote from a New Yorker article. "But many have puzzled over how Laudato Si can simultaneously be so sweepingly critical of the present and yet so hopeful about the future. The Church's faith in the power of ideas goes a long way towards explaining this tension. People of faith, particularly missionary faiths, believe deeply in something that a lot of secular people aren't so sure about, that all human beings are capable of profound change. They remain convinced that the right combination of argument, emotion, and experience can lead to life-altering transformations." As a writer, I think you're looking to often alter your vision or change your mind, because when you're confronted with a certain kind of intransigent reality, which can no longer be understood through existing frameworks, you are essentially forced to look elsewhere. And I think something like that began to happen more than 10 years ago, when India went through this profound moment of transformation, which had been in the making for some time, but the scale and the speed of what we saw in 2014 was particularly shocking. I mean, a lot of people, a lot of Americans are obviously shocked and bewildered by what has been happening in their country and by the new man who's taken charge there. But I think it's safe to say that the President of the United States had not been accused of mass murder before he became the President of the United States. And that was the case for many of us in India. And I think those of us who'd grown up thinking of India as a virtuous nation state, as a nation state with possibly, amongst all the nation states in Asia and Africa, with possibly the greatest amount of confidence, the greatest amount of political and moral virtue, because so many of the most famous names of the anti-colonial, anti-imperialist movements, whether it's Gandhi or Tagore, were associated with India, with India's freedom struggle. And we grew up with that sense of India as a great nation. And then to see this great anti-imperialist nation state turn imperialist, embrace ideologies of violence and hatred, that really came us as a great shock. And also, as I said, I think the existing frameworks of analysis, of interpretation, somehow seemed profoundly inadequate. So, for someone like my kind of background or training in a certain liberal left, vision of things in a sort of, broadly leftist, quasi-Marxist analysis, where you could blame a lot of things on monopoly capitalism, entering into an alliance with unscrupulous politicians, moving towards fascism, which are still the kind of analyses being trotted out as we speak about what's happening in different parts of the world today. But it was clear that people, and certainly, I mean, I saw a lot of people around myself, people in my own immediate family, my closest friends, succumb to a kind of ideological delirium that again made me think that these interpretations are not sufficient, that we have to move beyond them and to see what's really happening here at a much more fundamental level. And I think that's when I sort of started to think more systematically about the theories of René Girard. And because I suddenly realized that a lot of what he says about mimetic desire, the fact that we desire certain things because other people desire them, and that this notion that we have of the rational individual who's capable of forging his own path, of pursuing his or her own destiny autonomously, without really, being affected or having his or her decision making being shaped by some external factor, that this fundamental construct of the Enlightenment was profoundly flawed. That was his sort of basic argument. I'm offering a very simple version of it. And when I saw this, I could see this before I encountered Girard in the way the new nation states of Asia and Africa had emerged started to aspire towards nationhood in the late 19th century in a process of imitation, trying to imitate the very people who had degraded them, Western imperialists, and sort of seeking the wealth and power those Western imperialists had accumulated. And that was really the basis of all the major nationalist movements that began in the late 19th century, whether it was Zionism or Hindu nationalism, Buddhist nationalism, Islamic nationalism. And that, in a way, condemned them to be trapped in a certain replication of the pathologies that they claimed to be victimized by. And this is a dialectic that I could see happening in case after case, whether in the case of Israel, emerging again as a, first of all, insisting on its identity as again a state claiming a lot of virtue for itself, the virtue of victimhood, and then of course turning into perpetrators very quickly, soon after the formation of the Israeli nation state. There are any number of examples, including that of India. So again, and there are other examples. I mean, most conspicuous example of Japan, which emerged as a critic of Western imperialism, and then became one of the more vicious imperialist powers in the early 20th century. And it took a world war to essentially defeat that version of imperialism. Now, Girard really did not speak about the geopolitical sort of consequence or geopolitical connotations of his theory. But when I first encountered him, I could see this was incredibly relevant to the collective life of nations and societies, but also more importantly, the lives of individuals, especially as the world became more homogenized. And this started to happen in my lifetime in the early 90s with the arrival of new ideologies of individualism, of consumption, of consumerism, a new kind of ethic altogether of forming, cherishing, savoring the self through consumption, through a certain kind of projection of the self, through a certain kind of branding of self, and moving away from the old sort of collective projects, what Zaidi described as the common good, which were there in almost all of these societies and attended by a very different kind of spiritual and moral ethos, the ethos of renunciation, the ethos of austerity, the ethos of kind of praising powerlessness. But this was something different. The American or Americanized ideologies that were arriving in places like India emphasized this kind of self-making through consumption, through an assertion of power acquired through whatever means available to you, a certain kind of immorality built into it. And I think coming back to Naomi's book, I could sense that sort of process of rampant individualism turning into a global ideology, supplanting, replacing older ways of being, older modes of thought, older ethics, had created an unprecedented situation where individuals breaking free of allegiances to nation states, to communities, now saw themselves in a global arena, locked into competition with other individuals. And that was unleashing, generating a kind of pathologies that were really not they could not be contained by existing political solutions or institutions. And I think in that context, the book that Naomi published a few years ago struck me as one of the most original and provocative books I've read about this, because what you were saying, what you were describing, also your journey, Naomi, correct me if I'm wrong, was also a shift away from a certain conventional left position into something that actually was able to also see how a certain mode of identity creation, certain mode of conceiving the self was now really, to use the word, universal, and that was cutting across political divides, and that you could no longer be sure that one side of this political divide was virtuous, and that certain pathologies were kind of infecting almost every realm of political activity, and certainly the way in which individuals sought to project themselves into the wider world.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Well, first of all, thanks for having me here. Thanks for having us here, and thanks for creating the space to reflect in this way. I think you planned this before Francis died, and to be here reflecting after his passing it feels emotional to me, and very special and important. It's also nice to be here with Zaidi. Zaidi, I don't think we've ever done an event, side by side. But White Teeth and No Logo, our first books, came out the same year. And we've been on this sort of journey together as the world has changed, right? And so No Logo came out just on the cusp of the new millennium. Sometimes online, well, often people say it came out in 1999, and that's just because that was when it was supposed to come out. So it's, in the digital ether with its original publication date, it actually came out in 2000, and I long ago stopped trying to correct it. I just can't, but it came out January 2000. And it was trying to wrap its arms around, I suppose, this change that you're referring to. Because I'm of the generation that remembers like how travel changed, right? Where you could, like, you stopped being able to go to a new place and hear a new song. I remember when I was 18 going traveling, and just everywhere I went, everyone was playing the same song. And something essential about traveling was changing, right? And so I wrote Doppelganger in part because I wanted to come back to some of the themes in No Logo, but come back to them changed after a quarter of a century, like the world had changed and I had changed, and the movements that I've been a part of, the social movements that I've been a part of, have been changed by what I was trying to write about in many forces. But No Logo was it was about the rise of lifestyle branding, right? Which is very much about that mimetic desire and the desire to create a self based on a set of symbols that other people are adopting. Long predates branding. You know, we could argue that the church is one of the most successful branders of all time. But the extent to which the logic of what you're referring to, Pankaj, that sort of hyper-individualism, and even, but more specifically, like what makes a good brand, right? And because I studied branding to write No Logo and read a lot of writing by marketers and advertisers, brand builders, as they called themselves, right? It really is an exercise of repetition and discipline. A good brand is quite a static thing. I mean, you can have brand extensions and so on, but the truly sort of iconic brands are the brands that have the discipline not to change too much, right? I mean, even you think about a slogan like "Just do it," you know, or just the ability to travel through decades and still have the same identity, adapt it to the decades, but you sort of stay static. So it's an incredibly uncreative thing. And so when the idea arises that humans should be brands, right? I mean, when I wrote No Logo, that was a new idea. And it was an idea that was, at that point, restricted to celebrities, right? Michael Jordan could be a brand. Richard Branson could be a brand. But the idea that a non-celebrity could be a brand was a silly idea. Certain people were proposing it as a sort of consolation prize when you lost your job. And it was like, don't worry, in the future, we will all be brands, right? And that didn't make any sense because unlike celebrities, normal people don't have advertising agencies or PR people. So how are you supposed to project your brand if you're just like a person? So that idea was proposed by some management consultants and was just sort of laughed at. But then, you know, along comes the iPhone, along comes Facebook, and then Twitter. And lo and behold, we all have advertising agencies in our back pockets, and they're quote unquote free, right? So then it becomes possible actually for anybody to think of themselves the way a corporation might think of themselves, right? So this is beyond individualism. It's really the logic of the corporation entered into the individual self. And then I think what we've seen is how, I mean, I don't think it's so much a critique of the left as understanding that logic now governs the way we behave collectively as well. So a social movement can emerge based on somebody's ability to, well, the social movement doesn't emerge that way, but the public understanding of the social movement will emerge based on whoever within a social movement is particularly good at doing Twitter or doing Facebook. And so it emerges around a hashtag, which was a relatively new idea, but also it emerges, you know, who builds a follower count, right? So this has very, I mean, I'm hesitating just because this also isn't new. I mean, this happened to me as a writer when I wrote No Logo. The ultra globalization movement didn't really exist in public consciousness. But just as the book came out, there was a huge protest in Seattle, and it sort of took the mainstream media by surprise. Here in Italy, it was in Genoa. Some people will remember that. And in the same way that people with follower counts become the face of a movement, now I had just written a book that came out, and so because I'd written this book about anti-corporate resistance, I became the face of the movement, and I started speaking for it or being asked to speak for it, which I had no business doing. No one had elected me. There was no ways of holding me accountable. I was just a random person who'd written a book. And so I tried to navigate that, but it really creates problems in movements when you don't know how to get to the people who are the face of it, right? Unlike social movements in the past or traditional left, which, not to idealize it, but it had elected representatives, and there were ways of holding. If you didn't like the way they were leading a movement, you could get rid of them. Yeah. There were collective ways of drafting platforms and manifestos and things like that. So I think these are just ways that the logic of the corporation has entered both into our individual selves, but also into the collective ways that we organize, even against corporate power, even against imperialism, even against racial capitalism, anything. Like there's no outside of it.
Yeah. Well, I think in that sense, the journey from No Logo to Doppelganger seems quite logical, in that it, your own personal experience of being chosen as a kind of mascot, almost as a kind of logo for the anti-corporate movements back then. And to see how actually even a supposedly oppositional movement can actually end up replicating essentially the sort of primary logic of what it seeks to oppose, and how, again, but the sort of question really rises, how do we escape this? How do we escape this particular fate, where this sort of logic of wanting power seeks to make us all more and more, in a way, more and more, makes us resemble each other more and more. And again, with sort of with the incredibly impoverished sets of resources, skills that we might have had in the past, because we kind of, in a way, moved away from all that into this world where branding, projection, a certain kind of assertion of individuality, even if there's very little behind that individuality. I remember sort of growing up, and the whole idea of becoming an individual was connected to a very arduous process, of learning, of self-education. And the whole sort of the whole idea of no gain without pain, that was very much built into this notion of how do you acquire individuality. But to move from that into this new world that started to emerge in the 90s, where you can quickly create a persona for yourself that you put out there in the public realm, that again kind of this mode of individualism, which starts to undercut the various movements for solidarity that existed or could exist, that we desperately need at this point. And I often wonder whether we need to fundamentally critique a certain notion of empowerment. We sort of have, I suppose, upheld this idea for a very long period. And you look at the language of corporations, you look at the language of primary schools, the discourses. There's a lot about empowerment in there. There's so much premium placed on this idea of empowerment.
But I find myself struggling a little bit. Like, is it Is it about empowerment at this stage? Is it even about individualism? I think it's so entangled with fear. And this is why I think we have to make a distinction between any idea of individual self-expression or actually self-exploration and what's, I think, mainly going on, which is this idea of the entrepreneurial self or the monetized self, and that it being really interrelated with what I was saying, that the idea of personal branding first emerges when people are being laid off, in droves. It was the late 90s, and it was outsourcing, and it was the rise of the permanent temporary worker, the permatemp, and all of these corporations adopting a business model where they were trying to transcend the corporeal world in many ways, right? They wanted to own, they didn't want to own their factories. They wanted as small a staff as possible, core staff, and then everybody else would be contracts. This was a new and radical idea about what people could expect from employment, whether they were going to have a job that they would have some stability with, whether they would have a pension. And so out of that emerges this idea, don't worry, you can be a brand. You can, this is where you will have your future. You will be able to support yourself. So I when I talk to young people about this and I teach undergrads, a lot of them do it not because they want to, they do it because they think it's their only hope of actually making money in this wild world. That this is, this is an edge. It's tinged with terror. And the idea that it really is, even though these words around authenticity and self-expression get used, I don't think that's what's driving it. I think what's driving it is that it's kind of the only pathway that people still see that is legible, where people make enough money to support themselves. If you're good at it, you can get rich streaming. You can get rich. So if you're good at performing yourself, whatever that self is, but I just don't think, I think we have to bring a political economic lens to it, because I think it's the main driver more than anything else.
It is the main driver, but there is also, beyond the political and economic crisis, there is also moral and epistemological crisis. Actually, there's a paragraph in your book where you say, if we can stand to look at the shadowlands, even for a moment, it becomes clear that we are ensnared in a web of life-annihilating lies. And it's entirely possible that Steve Bannon's and Naomi Wolf's war on reality is just what happens when so many of the big lies that built the modern world visibly crumble. As the house collapses, many people choose to take flight into full-blown fantasy, sure, but that doesn't mean that the rest of us who were also born and raised in that house are guardians of the truth. What then are many of us still not seeing, still avoiding in these shadow-laden woods? So there is, I think, you're pointing, and you point in the rest of the book too, that there is, I suppose, a revelation that many of us find quite devastating about the role of violence in the making of the modern world. And, the fact that so many of the truths that have been offered to us by ruling ideologies or the dominant ideologies, especially of liberalism, a certain kind of humanitarian ideology has turned out to be a lie, or if not a deliberate lie, but certainly a mode of untruth, which we are all expected to inhabit. And I think in that sense, we are kind of looking at a full-blown epistemological crisis, not just a crisis caused by precarious employment, and there is the fact that there are no kind of institutions, belief systems, ways of thinking that can anchor people, and a lot of those have been delegitimized, discredited. And a range of them, from sort of socialism to the thinking of indigenous peoples, they're all on the margins, and that makes for makes for a kind of impoverished arena where most people think, well, all they can do is really desperately project themselves in this, and hope to gain some kind of a benefit from it.
Doppelganger came out in 2023, and it's looking at these different kinds of doubles and doppelgangers that we create, our digital doubles to represent us that we know aren't really us and that we polish up and so on. It has a little bit about AI, not very much, because it was just like ChatGPT hadn't yet come out, right? We were concerned about deep fakes, but I don't think that we understood the extent to which. And Arundhati Roy, our mutual friend, talks about how we were sort of already behaving like chatbots before the chatbots, right? So it's also the way in which our speech gets mechanized, in these very prescribed ways, and then we're more replaceable by machines the more we behave like machines. And I think that's true of art as well, right? Like the more formulaic art is, the easier it is for the machines to plausibly replace it. But we really are on the cusp, I think, of a whole other kind of mimetic world. And if I had the book to write over again, I would have a lot more about this literal mirror world that is emerging with stunning speed and entering into many of the spaces that we rely on to be alternatives to them. I mean, the extent to which post-secondary institutions are now fully embracing AI and pushing it is, I think, quite shocking. It's gone from being something they're afraid of, students using to write their essays, to something that they're pushing their professors to use to, teach for them. But the extent to which that mirror world is really a vampiric world on our world, right? That it is draining the literal water life force of this world. So not like draining the creative life force, replacing the ability, it was already hard for artists to make a living. But now you have artists not just competing with Instagram influencers who are sort of ripping off their style, but competing with themselves, right? Competing with machines that were trained without their permission off of their art, and are now, being used by publications and so on. I mean, this is happening so very, very quickly, but also vampiric in the sense that the use of energy, specifically fossil fuels, the use of water for this massive rollout of data centers. And so to build that mirror world, to build that mimetic world, we sacrifice this world. And it's in the name of, but don't worry, it'll fix climate change for us. And I think Francis was really turning his attention to this at the end of his life. And I think we all really need to focus on this. I was at the Vatican in 2015 for the launch of Laudato Si. It was an extraordinary experience, but one of the most extraordinary things was just being able to witness this very deep theological debate that was happening between people who were positioning Laudato Si, which is sometimes called like the climate change encyclical, or the ecological encyclical, as a continuation of work. That the Catholic Church, the Vatican, has a long history of work in defense of the environment, versus the idea that it really was a rupture. And so I wrote a piece that you mentioned for The New Yorker. I quoted Father Sean McDonough, who was there, who got very worked up, saying, we can't deny that we were, and he was talking about himself in Ireland, raised in a church that taught us to hate this world. I pulled his quote just to share because it was so interesting. So I mean, it talked a lot about, Yeah, he said, we're moving to a new theology, and he translated a Latin prayer that was once commonly recited after communion. Teach us to despise the things of the earth and to love the things of heaven. And really saying that if we want to defend this earth, then we have to actually get at that, and we have to sort of re-enchant and find the sacredness in this realm. And I think more in the age of AI, it's really about defending the animate world. So I was just thinking when I was looking at human fraternity, I was just remembering in the encyclical that Francis wrote about Francis, his namesake, of Assisi, ministering to plants and fish, and seeing the plants as his sisters. So the fraternity was beyond the human. The fraternity was to all living beings. And this was very controversial, particularly among conservative Catholics in the United States. And before we go to questions, which I see we have to do, I'll just read a headline from The Federalist that came out right around the time that we were here to support the launch of the encyclical. And the headline was, Pope Francis, the earth is not my sister. That's all.
We have time for a few questions.
I'm really interested in everything everyone is saying, and I wasn't expecting to come here today, so this is very exciting to me. And I was thinking of what was being said earlier about the sort of loneliness that we're feeling in this sort of mirror world. And of course, Zadie wisely has detached herself from digital life, but it's very hard to do that. But in this mirror world that you're talking about, I'm really curious about this idea of re-enchantment and about sort of refusing the loneliness that we're all feeling with a sense of purpose and enchantment that is heavily connected to the world and earth and the life that we see in a tangible way. And I'm just curious to know what your thoughts are on that, or if you've given it some thought, because I know it's also a new sort of philosophical current. There's a couple of books that have come out in Italy about this idea of re-enchantment, and I'm really looking into it. And you said the word, so I wanted to ask you about it.
Yeah, I mean, I'm lucky to live in a part of the world where that enchantment has never left. And I live in British Columbia, which is part of the world where I guess colonization came a bit later. 80% of British Columbia is unceded Indigenous land, meaning there's no treaty, there's no piece of paper anyone can point to. All there are the papal bulls, which they've asked to be rescinded many times. I have to say that. But that sacredness is everywhere in Indigenous art, in Coast Salish art, that was banned. I mean, it was the potlatch ceremonies were criminalized. Indigenous, masks were seized, made their way into the art world. I'm writing a piece for Pankaj's soon to be launched journal, and it's brought me down a various journey of like the surrealists who were exiled from Europe during the Second World War, discovered these masks in the secondhand shop in New York, and they knew that they had incredible powers. And in fact, André Breton thought that he had found the original surrealists when he found these masks from British Columbia and Alaska. And they thought they were portals. And in fact, in Indigenous cosmology, they are portals between worlds, but they were also stolen. And so there's been this long process of trying to get the masks returned to the communities that they were stolen from. And the Breton family brought back the mask that they had, and they were part of a repatriation ceremony, bringing it home. So I think that part of it is just finding the enchantment that never left, right? Because I think in every part of the world, there are people who have held on to those ways of knowing. And I think one of the things that's interesting about Francis is that he came from Latin America, and in many parts of the world, the church, that battle between the sacredness of here and nature, and the idea that sacredness was in another realm, was reconciled in ways that were and this was the point that Father McDonough was making. He was saying in Ireland it was never fully successful, that streams still had spirits and trees still had spirits, and so I think it's kind of an unearthing process and a listening process, and I think it's also a feminist process.
I would say very quickly, I mean, this it strikes me as you were speaking that there have been two moments in the last 100 years where people within a powerful Western part of the world have tried to, re-enchant themselves, and that has been accomplished, if it has been accomplished at all, mostly by these people exposing themselves to the philosophies and worldviews of the non-West. One moment was after the First World War, when it was very widely felt that rationality, science, technology had, led Europe into this horrific civil war, into total destruction. And so we need to learn from these other religions and traditions, Hermann Hesse, or T.S. Eliot, or Christopher Isherwood, or Somerset Maugham. I mean, it's incredible the number of people, Huxley, number of people who, actually reached out for this, what they thought would be a kind of way of re-enchanting the world. And then the second one was, of course, 1960s, and there were many figures then. And actually, someone I should mention here who was very important, has been personally very important to me, is Thomas Merton, who traveled to Asia and also engaged very seriously with Hindu philosophy, with Buddhist traditions. And again, I think that was also a project of sort of re-enchanting the world. Sorry, at the back, gentleman.
Thank you. I would like to hear your take, especially Mrs. Naomi Klein, on something else that has not been criticized in a way, because all of the things that we talk about also are happening in China, which is very interesting. Is it an alternative in a way? It's a very hybrid regime, highly secular, communist, capitalist, also very much efficient, technocratic, spies people. There's various things. There are cameras on churches also. It's one of the biggest polluters, also ecologically speaking, maybe the biggest one. So all these things put together, is this an alternative, or can you apply some of those critics used for the West also to China?
Yeah, I mean, as you said, it's an amalgamation of pretty much everything. I mean, it's such a huge question. I don't know. That's a little bit too big. I mean, obviously, I have criticisms of every regime, and certainly talking about AI. I mean, it's all like the reason why this is rolling out as quickly as it is without the debate that it deserves, especially because the makers of Sam Altman, the head of OpenAI, they're working towards what they call AGI, and it's a very hard to define what reaching artificial general intelligence would be. But when pressed, they say it's when the majority of human economic activity is done better by AI. So that would seem to merit like a bit of a pause and a conversation about whether we actually would like to replace the majority of what we do with machines, because that has just absolutely unfathomably large implications for us. Like, how will we earn a living, right? For starters. But the reason why it's rolling out without any of those debates is because we're in an arms race with China, right? And China's moving ahead very quickly with it. So, yeah.
Camilla?
Naomi, this is specifically for you, but Pankaj, I think you might want to weigh in as well. Naomi, when you talk about your students and their awareness of themselves as a brand, and particularly how that relates to fear and economics and their economic potential, I wonder if you could say a little about whether you've been surprised by the size and scale of the Gaza protests on campuses. Because, I was in October 23, I was talking to some of the student protesters, and even that early on, they were very aware that there would be quite possibly very severe consequences in terms of whether they'd get hired and how the university would respond to them. So if you could just talk about that, and is it sort of do we see them sort of step aside from the question of branding, or are they rebranding themselves in some ways? Could you just talk about those campus protests and what they're telling us about what's going on with the students?
Yeah, it's such a good question, and there is not an easy answer to that. But I have been surprised in lots of ways. But also the story, I don't think is finished. I don't think I don't think we know how this latest wave of repression of student protesters, and particularly international students, will play out for the generation after them. Because it's mass communication what's going on now, with like the thing about social media and personal branding and all of this is you're taught as a very young person to sort of time travel, right? So, and your parents and your teachers and your guidance counselors would say, don't post anything that you wouldn't want somebody who might hire you or university admissions board to read. And so, they're a teenager, it's hard to think about next week, but still you're having to project yourself. What might I want? Right? And so then maybe you create like a fake Instagram account, and that's where you do things that you don't want the guidance counselor to see, or your parents. But now, right, people are being told, don't post anything that you wouldn't want, Marco Rubio to read. And so how is that going to prescribe what kind of politics we see? Maybe people will just rebel. I have been shocked by the resilience of the student protesters, even in the face of the very, very severe economic consequences. It's also challenged, frankly, I saw the massive increases in university tuition in the United States and elsewhere. I believe that would be a disciplining force. Like if your parents are spending $70,000 to send you to NYU or however much it is, what kind of student is going to come? Or if you have to have multiple jobs in order to support your education, you have less space for activism. So everything that I thought I turned out to be wrong. They are taking greater risks than I've seen in my lifetime, and it's really extraordinary. And they are Pankaj wrote about this in his book. They really are the conscience of the world in so many ways, and they're relentless. And just this latest wave of convocation, disruptions and addresses. They're not stopping, and they're creating community. And some of what I wrote about in Doppelganger around the effect of celebrity activism on social movements has sort of been resolved because people are not being rewarded for being. No one's putting them on the cover of Vanity Fair. Let's just say, like for within their keffiyehs. So a lot of the sort of the effects of celebrity activism, are no longer in play. But I don't think that they're immune from some of the crueler effects of social media, the social media discourse. I think there are still rewards. I think there are still rewards and there are still, kind of mimetic behaviors. These are mimicry machines, and they reward the mob. And so even if it doesn't have the same rewards as, say, climate activism a few years ago, there are other ways that people are building celebrity, and yeah. So I wouldn't idealize it, but I still think it's extraordinary.
I would agree with Naomi. I think for the first time since the Arab Spring protests, we've seen a very large group of people confirm yet again, what was also key insight for Gandhi when he was leading the nonviolent struggle, which was, a political protest that is driven by fear is going to fail. It has to accommodate the virtue of sacrifice. If you're not sacrificing something, if you're not exposing yourself to risks that cannot be quantified, that cannot be predicted, then that political protest is in great danger of proving ineffective. And I think that's, what you're saying, Naomi, it's really important that they knew that the consequences would be devastating. And yet they continue to do it even today. And I think, again, there is hope to be drawn there, because these people are going to be in positions of power and influence in 10 years' time. So they've had a different kind of education, a different kind of moral education. And I'd say they've really kind of, in a way, reinvigorated our faith in individual conscience.
Hi, I just had a question about the other side of mimetic desire is what Nijira termed scapegoating. And having recently lost perhaps the moral leader in this world, and having scapegoating and mimetic desire both weaponized, I don't know if that's the right word, but weaponized by figures like Peter Thiel and J.D. Vance. Under him, Peter Thiel was a student of René Girard's, for those who may not know. Weaponizing it in terms of a certain form of discourse in a post-truth world. So they've kind of conflated these two ideas to create a narrative that suits themselves and suits an agenda. And as I mentioned, we recently lost perhaps the world moral leader, and I was just wondering, in both of your opinions, how can, let's say, the other side of the discussion regain some ground that has been lost in this front? Thank you.
Part of it is choice. I think there are. I think we lost a moral leader with a massive institutional platform. But I think there are many moral leaders that we can choose to hold up and join. And yeah, no, I was just thinking a bit about the Gaza flotilla right now, the Madlin, that I don't know exactly what's happened, because it's sort of happening right now, where I know that the IDF has intercepted the boat and seized it. But what was interesting is they called it the selfie boat, right? So they tried to reduce the people on it to what we're talking about. They tried to make them seem like they are just in it for themselves. And and I think people know that that is not true, but that's what they believe will hurt them most, will hurt a figure like Greta most, is if they can convince the world that Greta is just about Greta. But I think we know that Greta is not just about Greta, right? So I think that there are a lot of people who are stepping into moral leadership right now, and they need our support.
We've run out of time, sadly, but hope we can continue this conversation